Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Hello, and welcome to the Climate and Clean Energy series at Cal Poly Humboldt. Since 2005, the Schatz Energy Research Center has hosted guest lectures, panel discussions, and research webinars like this one to stimulate collaboration and knowledge exchange. I'll give a quick introduction to our team for those of you who are joining us for the first time. The Schatz Energy Research Center is proud to be a part of Cal Poly Humboldt. Our campus is nested within a rural coastal community which borders California's second largest inland bay. The Schatz Center has been involved in clean energy innovation since 1989, working on solutions here in Humboldt, across California, and around the globe. Our North Coast region has become a hub for clean energy solutions, from solar microgrid design to floating offshore wind. And it's important to us that these solutions be equitable and community sustaining. So we're honored this spring to be joined by the 44 Feet research team, a program of the Sea Level Institute here at Humboldt. Jennifer Marlowe and Alec Brown will describe a series of workshops they recently conducted to facilitate a common understanding of climatic and environmental risks to the spent nuclear fuel site on Humboldt Bay, and to share strategies for managing hazards to public health and safety. Jennifer Marlowe is an assistant professor of environmental law in the Environmental Science and Management Department here at Cal Poly Humboldt, and the founder of the 44 Feet Project. Alexander Brown is a graduate research assistant and master's candidate in the Department of Natural Resources Environmental Science and Management program. Their presentation tonight will be followed by a Q&A discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time. If you have any technical difficulties, please post to the chat box and we will try to help you resolve the problem. This evening's talk is being recorded and will be available online next week at schatzcenter.org/events. Jen and Alec, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Maya, Arnie, and all of our attendees. I'm glad to be giving this presentation this evening. I will say that I'm in the same room as Jen, so you'll see us kind of switching back and forth, but I hope it works out well. So this is our project. We'll be presenting on 44 feet, vulnerabilities, opportunities, and strategies for managing risk from sea level rise to Humboldt Bay's spent nuclear fuel site. And as Maya was talking about, we'll be discussing some of our focus group convenings that examine potential futures for the spent nuclear fuel site on Boone Point. I'd like to thank our funders as well, California Sea Grant, the CSU Council on Ocean Affairs, Science and Technology, and we had tremendous help from the Sea Level Rise Institute and the Cascadia Coastlines and Peoples Research Hub. So I will go ahead and jump in here. This is our agenda. For the first section, I'll be discussing the general and site-specific risk assessments, as well as basics for spent nuclear fuel, what it is. Then section 2, Jen will come in and discuss research frameworks, the process and the outputs. And then we'll kind of come back together for the big picture and discuss the relationship between Humboldt Bay and nuclear power and waste. So for general and site-specific risks and spent nuclear fuel basics, these are just some pictures of potential risks and coastal hazards. You have sea level rise, coastal flooding, erosion, seismic risks, and I'll discuss a few of these more in depth. But first, I want to discuss nuclear power in the U.S. Nuclear power supplies approximately 20% of US electricity. It's the third largest electricity source in the United States. There are 93 operating commercial nuclear reactors at 55 nuclear power plants across 28 states, most of which are on the eastern seaboard. There are some in the Midwest and then a few on the West Coast as well, as you can see from this graphic. There are 23 shut down commercial nuclear power reactors at 19 sites, and these are all in various stages of decommissioning. These are some trends in nuclear power. In this graphic on the top right here, you can see that generation has increased since nuclear's inception in the 1960s. It's sort of stabilized with a few increases and decreases, but as you can see, the United States remains the largest producer of nuclear power. France has the largest share of electricity generated of nuclear power. It's about 70% of their total share. China is the fastest growing nuclear power nation. They have 16 new reactors under construction, and then India follows them with about 8 under construction. And then in the US, there are trends that have pretty much stabilized up until this point. And this is despite various policy shocks that have followed major nuclear incidents, such as 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, and then Fukushima in 2011. And you can see that the stabilization is pretty much across the board. Spent nuclear fuel is an interesting topic in and of itself. I think a lot of us think that this is what it is. Maybe it's this sort of neon glowing green liquid. And I will put your fears to rest. Or hopefully, I don't know, but it's actually this. So this is commercial spent nuclear fuel, that which has been irradiated to generate electricity. It's solid and it's metallic, and it's arranged in these assemblies and organized in this way. So it's not the liquid that we think of in the movies. After it's been irradiated to generate electricity, it goes into a spent fuel pool where it can cool off for about 10 to 20 years. It's extremely hot. Then after that, it can be transferred to dry cask systems, such as the one in the bottom left here, for about 40 to 60 years. And they come in different sizes and shapes and formations. They can be horizontal, they can be underground. But the idea here is that they can last that way for 40 to 60 years approximately. And then the idea after that is that they go into a deep geologic repository. And there are several projects going on right now to combine engineered and natural barriers, including rock and salt and clay, which essentially gives no obligation to actively maintain the facility. This is called the multi-barrier concept. It's the waste packaging, the engineered repository, and then the geology all provide barriers to prevent radionuclides from reaching humans in the environment. 10 countries have proposed projects. 6 countries have planned projects and actually have selected a site for this deep geologic repository. But only one has commenced construction of a deep geologic repository, and that is in Finland. As you notice at the bottom of this column here on the left, the United States, their program has been suspended. And this was at Yucca Mountain. I'll discuss that in a bit, but this is sort of the direction that we're heading, is that we don't have this final step in the pathway. And that's where we're at. Spent nuclear fuel in the United States, it's sort of an issue because we have obviously the greatest nuclear fleet, which means we have the most spent nuclear fuel. It's reached about 85,000 metric tons, and that's projected to grow by about 2,000 metric tons each year. And as the country with the largest nuclear fleet in the world, the United States ought to have a robust nuclear waste disposal program, but unfortunately it does not at this point. And I guess the next question is, where does Humboldt Bay factor into this? So Humboldt Bay has an independent spent fuel storage installation. It's a mouthful. It's called the advocacy. Here's California and Humboldt Bay. And here's that really cool photograph from an airplane. As you can see, the site is right adjacent to the entrance to the bay. It's owned and operated by Pacific Gas and Electric, a private utility company. And then this is an aerial photograph showing this advocacy right here. And it has a pretty small footprint. The nuclear power plant is decommissioned as of 2021. this is the remainder of what we have and what we're dealing with and what our research centers on. So the Humboldt Bay asphyxie stores 37 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel across 390 fuel assemblies, which are those bundle of rods I showed you earlier. Five casks out of the 6 that you see here at the bottom of the screen contain spent nuclear fuel, whereas the 6th cask contains greater than Class C waste. And this is all at this site location, 115 feet from the seawall and 44 feet above sea level. That's where we get our project title from. And our asphyxie in Humboldt Bay is actually slightly underground. It's below grade in a concrete vault. And these are the cask systems developed specifically for Humboldt Bay. These are about 19 feet tall, about 11 feet in diameter, and each weighs in at about 187,000 pounds. So they're very large, very robust systems, very engineered. And this is what we have. And the Humboldt Bay asphyxie is the 2nd smallest storage installation in the US. As you can see from this graphic here, we only have 6 casks. San Onofre in San Clemente, California, for instance, has 134 casks. And although we're the smallest or the 2nd smallest, our asphyxie is classified as one of the most at-risk sites to climate change. And that same study by Jenkins et al. In 2020, it was a geospatial analysis. It found that with 6 feet of sea level rise, 7 spent fuel sites will be juxtaposed by seawater, and 3 of those will be near or completely surrounded and should be considered a priority for mitigation. Of course, Humboldt Bay rings in at the first of the list. And this graphic here is not from that study, but this is actually a local sea level rise expert, Alderon Laird. And this is not 6 feet of sea level rise. This is, in fact, 3.3 feet of sea level rise, but it's on top of a king tide, which is the highest annual tide that we can experience in a given year. But this is sort of what 6 feet might look like. And you can see that it's inundating the main access roads, Highway 101. The generating station is nearly underwater, most parts of it. And then major portions of the seawall are inundated. The asphyxie itself is still dry at this point, but it begs the question of what do we do with access? How do we get personnel, safety equipment? How do we remove the waste if we have to? Can we protect this if this is a veritable island situation? And that sea level rise is really a result of carbon emissions, of course. That's what's causing climate change, global warming, which melts ice caps and then increases the level of the oceans. But plate tectonics also play a major role in this. And we live near the Mendocino Triple Junction, which is this place where all of these plate tectonics interact. So for instance, you have the Pacific plate, the North American plate, and the Gorda plate, and then also the Juan de Fuca plate to some extent. They're all interacting and causing subduction. And in some places, the Earth is rising, it's uplift, and in other places, it's subsiding, it's sinking. And PG&E maintains that that long-term tectonic uplift will actually outpace sea level rise at this location. It's been nearly 18 years since PG&E has updated the sea level rise science that's cited in its annual safety reporting documents. However, conventional understanding is that Humboldt Bay is actually subsiding, and quite quickly. In most areas here, it's subsiding, which will lead to a rate of relative sea level rise 2 to 3 times higher than the rest of the West Coast. And this is according to estimates of vertical land motion by Patton et al. In 2017. And there are forthcoming articles coming out on this as well. So stay tuned. The outdated assumptions are clear, though. Those plate tectonics also contribute to seismic activity. In the top left, you can see that this is the extent of landward fault lines near the bay. And then this is a georeference of nearby earthquakes, earthquake events from 1900 to 2015. And actually, I put this star icon on there. I found this. This was actually the recent magnitude 6.4 earthquake that happened just last December, which was quite a large one for us. It's not the biggest. So this could actually perhaps include more recent earthquakes, but it's just to show that there is a lot of activity here, lots of seismic activity going on, potential risks from that. And then, of course, you have with plate tectonics and sea level rise, and the fact that it's at the mouth of the bay, offshore storms, what have you, we have shoreline erosion and shoreline retreat and bluff erosion. And we've actually lost about 1,500 feet of shoreline between the years 1870 and 1970. There's a protective revetment wall that was built in the 50s and repaired in the 70s, and it exists today. It's remained pretty static for that point, which is good. It's very protective, but history shows us that this is what's happened. And then also this historical photo right here is the coast of Boone Point, which is where the Asphyxia is located. This was 71 years ago. And then just this last year, or this January, I took this photo of the same place, and you can see that it's vegetated clearly, but that slope is considerably smaller now. The bluff has been eroded to this point. So these are all the risks, and they're super important for our research inquiry. But before we get into the framework of our research, I want to also briefly discuss another layer that was critical in shaping our research. And that's the way that uncertainty influences the spent nuclear fuel planning and decision-making processes. So going back to sea level rise, we understand it to be a nonlinear process. We know the general direction. You can see from these graphics at the top left, it's going up. We know that. We know the direction of change, but the resulting effects are currently unknown, and how they will affect different communities and different landscapes are unknown. Uncertainty really becomes an issue after 2050, whereby our projections don't hold up against that uncertainty. We don't know exactly, whether emissions scenarios drop, or whether communities or society can figure out adaptation or retreat, or can we pull our most critical infrastructure away from the coast. It's a lot of uncertainty in that process, not to mention the fact that ice sheets and ocean physics and the changes that are happening could impact that equation quite drastically. We also understand sea level rise to be a threat multiplier, so it could create unknown environmental triggers, cascading events, and convergent risks. So sea level rise on its own may not be something to worry about, but the fact that it increases the height of tsunamis, it increases coastal erosion, all of these really factor into the fact that it's a threat multiplier. Luckily, we have some values to plug in. We can create projections and sort of make the best guess on this. We have the California Sea Level Rise Guidance update from 2018, and the California Ocean Protection Council urges communities and resource managers to use the H++ scenario, which is that far right column. And it's not tied to a specific emissions trajectory, but it should be considered, according to the Ocean Protection Council, for projects with a lifespan beyond 2050 that have either a low tolerance for risk, and they could be things like large power plants, major airports and roads, wastewater treatment plants, and hazardous waste and toxic storage sites. So for us, that made sense to use, and we generated our own framework to understand this, our own maps, and those are the figures that we used. But nonetheless, uncertainty is ever present in sea level rise science, and I think that's something we have to come to terms with. We also have long planning horizons. Nuclear fuel wastes remain hazardous for thousands of years. By contrast, recorded human history only goes back about 5,000 years. Human civilization is estimated to be about 10,000 years old. Copland in 2008 really succinctly summarizes this. He says that while the impacts of global warming are described as intergenerational, the impacts of the nuclear waste cycle are better described as intercivilizational. And do we have the engineering capabilities to ensure that defense in depth that I described earlier for 10,000, 100,000, let alone 1,000,000 years? It's just the fact that planning with this horizon in mind is not something that humans are very good at, unfortunately. And then something that's really important to our research is political and regulatory barriers, and understanding how these increase uncertainty in many areas of research. For the first thing, there is currently no agreed upon methodology for long-term storage of spent nuclear fuel in the United States. Of course, we know that scientific consensus points to that deep geologic disposal concept. And while plans for disposal of spent fuel are well advanced in Finland, Sweden, and France, the US has experienced multiple political delays. And many of these come from these regulatory pressures from decades-old laws. The Atomic Energy Act of 1954 preempts all radiological aspects of safety and storage to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Nuclear Waste Management Act of 1982 mandates that the Department of Energy take ownership and possession of all commercial spent nuclear fuel in the US and permanently dispose of it at Yucca Mountain, which is in Nevada, by the year 1998. Of course, that year has come and passed, but they still have title to the waste, and it's still their responsibilities solely to dispose of it. We also have political barriers to permanent disposal, this concept of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. People simply don't want it, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But there's policy that follows from that as well. And in 2005, the United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit struck down regulations governing public exposure from the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. The regulations at the beginning only accounted for hazards associated with waste disposal during the first 10,000 years, which to me is a long time. Obviously, I think a lot of us. But the court held that the United States EPA must consider risks of up to 1 million years, essentially creating this unfathomable timeline masked by technical standards, but very much highly political motivations. Then we also have the timeline for eventual relocation of spent nuclear fuel from shutdown sites. It's speculative at this point. And the Department of Energy released, sorry, I'm just fixing something here. The Department of Energy released a 2017 preliminary evaluation of removing used nuclear fuel from shutdown sites, and it estimated a waste retrieval date of the year 2032. But there's no interim or permanent sites available for disposal, and that's likely to take a decade or more to site and construct one. And that's despite Department of Energy's efforts to advance consent-based siting and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's tentative approval of privately owned storage facilities. So several court challenges have sidelined this option and will likely prolong this retrieval date estimate further, excuse me. And then of course we have interim storage options outside of Yucca require congressional amendment for approval. So this is the status quo. The California Coastal Commission assumes that the asphyxia will be on site in perpetuity. And then PG&E echoes that as well. And they understand that no off-site alternative locations are available, and they're uncertain as to when, if ever, such an agreement would be reached. Just going back to this idea of social license and the fact of the status quo, PG&E and the NRC assume that the waste is safe and the waste will be removed from the site by 2032. The NRC states that sea level rise and tsunamis are not considered a threat to the safety of the facility. David McIntyre, NRC spokesperson, also mentions that there's no accident scenario that would lead to a radiation release. And so the question we asked in response were, to whom is the risk not negligible, and for how long can the site safety be assumed, and who gets to decide? And if anything's safe, it's likely safe to assume that the waste will be stored on site beyond 2032. And if we can't come to grips with this multiplicity of conflicting timelines, values, scientific findings, regulatory directives, then we need to find a different way of thinking about uncertainty in the future and actually embrace it. And so throughout this research project, we aim to understand the local context better, to engage with the people and the entities that might drive decision-making on actions to prevent radiation exposure, either through protection or relocation, or just a better understanding of the risks associated with storage on a dynamic coastline. And spreading awareness and building coalitions that write local people into the narrative has been a major component of our research. And so that brings me to this, and I will pass it over to Jen, and then I'll meet you soon.
Thank you, Alec, and thanks to everyone for being here. I wanted to begin section 2 to describe our research framework, our process and outputs for integrating local voice and interests and values into this question about who decides and what factors are important when decisions are made and whose voices contribute to those identifications of values and interests. So we decided to work on this project in a way not just to understand sea level rise risk and coastal hazards to the ISPC, but to learn from the community members in Humboldt, in the region, from tribal nations, tribal leaders, and those that have been invested in the decommissioning process in partnership with PG&E. How can we engage them in these questions? And so we convened a diverse group of volunteer project participants to define what our current needs are, what our future desires even were. We identified Rumsfeld's famous known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. We spun up scenarios of future worlds, worlds that PG&E has testified that aren't plausible. But we felt it was important to assess what worlds we could potentially inhabit and how to know when we might be moving into those worlds. And that would help us move more confidently in directions that we wanted to go versus passively reacting to events. How can we orient more proactively? So we formed several convening processes to engage our local community. And this vision convened our group around a statement that really proclaimed our point of interest in this research, and a vision about a future where creativity, equity, transparency, and foresight guide conversations around spent nuclear fuel management in Humboldt Bay and elsewhere, where knowledge is accessible and shared openly, where resources leverage the most impact, and where coalitions can help fill technical and political gaps, and where the public can enjoy a safe and resilient Humboldt Bay without risk of radioactive exposure. So these are the values that we bring to the project, and I think it's important that we make those evident because I believe our policy is aiming to inform a policy, or our research is aiming to inform a policy agenda that matches this vision. The focal question we convened participants around was one about whether the waste should stay or go, and particularly before 2065. And why 2065? This is the date when multiple events intersect, including the storage license for the ISPC expires in 2065. The storage casks are expiring at that time. Their design life expires. There will be 1 meter or approximately 3 feet of sea level rise expected to periodically inundate the site and its main access thoroughfares. And it's also past that 2050 timeline where uncertainty increases. It also is close enough to the present that it makes it tenable for us to conceptualize the future. Once we get too far beyond this timeline, the exercise might feel a little futile. The questions that guided our convenings also asked about the role of the community and non-experts in the responsible management of spent nuclear fuel. It's such a technocratic, expert-driven, insular community that directs the safety protocols and decision-making for reasons that are understandable, but also it appears that the process is somewhat designed to exclude participation by those that aren't considered experts. We also wondered what values, interests, and frameworks might guide decision-making about the future of our spent fuel on Humboldt Bay, and the answer to this question about whether there's enough consensus in our community to advocate for the waste's removal. Third, how might the goal of responsible long-term management of spent nuclear fuel on Humboldt Bay become better integrated with Humboldt Bay resilience planning efforts that are being led by tribes and our community? There's lots going on. Humboldt Bay is a leader in this space, and I think it's important to integrate these long-term future considerations into the shorter-term planning agendas of regional planning efforts. And then finally, how might our research contribute to a policy agenda that is more accountable to changing site-specific conditions of spent nuclear fuel sites at Humboldt scale, state, federal, and international scales? As Alec mentioned, this is not just a specific problem unique to our community. So to engage these questions, we engaged members of our community, tribes, government agency representatives, academics, elected officials, decision makers, community members, community advisory board members, PG&E, NRC, industry representatives, and other people that have some experience working within this industry. Asking questions about participants' risks, the participants' perception of the risks, participants' values, interests, knowledges, attitudes, expertise, and lived experiences with respect to this spent nuclear fuel issue on Humboldt Bay. In addition to asking about these particular values, interests, risks, perceptions, et cetera, we wanted to identify and understand better the drivers of future change, so conditions that might hinder or facilitate decision-making in the future. We organized drivers of change into 5 different categories, as is requested by the scenario planning methodology that we followed. So participants identified drivers of change in political, cultural, and social, technical, economic, and environmental categories. The drivers that people came up with are here depicted in this visual tree that Alec made. Examples include the financial solvency of PG&E, the lifespan of the storage casks, the recognition of tribal sovereignty in this decision-making space, the pace of bluff erosion, the availability of federal repositories or interim storage sites. These are the kinds of elicited drivers of change that people came up with. Participants found some drivers more impactful and uncertain than others, and we identified the ones that were the most important and most uncertain as a way to construct plausible futures or scenarios. Scenario analysis is a really interesting tool. It's a well-established method for establishing a forum for information exchange around a focal question that assesses plausible futures under highly uncertain conditions. Scenario planning weaves together science, imagination, and storytelling to communicate meaning in these highly uncertain contexts. Scenario worlds are futures made tangible despite their uncertainty. They dare to imagine maybe what technocratic regulators deem to be not hypothetically possible. They invite the apprehension of uncertainty. They situate the problem within both scientific and non-scientific perspectives and advance values-informed decision-making, which is why we chose this methodology to guide our process. So we explored the drivers and we mapped various iterations where drivers informed endpoints on axes of uncertainty. And then we plotted our top 2 drivers on opposing axes to compose the 4 scenario worlds that you see here on the slide. On our x-axis, we plotted the risks of protecting the spent nuclear fuel in place, unsafe on the left side of the x-axis and safe on the right side of the x-axis. And to understand the y-axis, we plotted levels of public engagement as high and low. So low on the bottom and high on the top of the y-axis. This created 4 distinct worlds. For example, we named the world Nightmare, where protecting the spent nuclear fuel in place was deemed to be unsafe and public engagement was low. So that's the lower left quadrant of the scenario matrix. In the opposite corner, we named the world Empowered Safety, where protection in place was deemed to be safe and public education and engagement were high. And in the lower right-hand corner of the matrix, we named the world we are in now, Deep Sleep, where the risks of protecting the spent nuclear fuel in place is safe, or deemed safe for now. The public education and engagement around this issue is low. These outcomes informed our own community engaged recommendations that we'll share with you next for how the responsible long-term storage of the spent nuclear fuel can be managed in ways that hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. The recommendations came out of the interview process around the scenario planning workshops and some focus group workshops. Generally speaking, the recommendations supported ideas for collaborative research and engagement strategies that would accommodate multiple plausible futures. The first being collaborative partnerships, the second being joint fact-finding initiatives, the third recommendation being examining mitigation, monitoring, and management strategies. The fourth being reviewing PG&E and nuclear industry standards and updating them to conform with best available science. The fifth being requesting consequence analysis of several beyond design basis scenarios or accident scenarios that the industry doesn't deem to be plausible or credible or don't influence design criteria or technical specifications of the advocacy. And last, public engagement. I wanted to walk you through each of these with one slide each to give you a sense for what the focus group participants recommended as a result of our collaboration. The first, forming collaborative partnerships. I think that was a very strong emerging focus of our initiative, is that this should be this approach should come from a place that promotes data sharing and resource sharing, collaboration, and prioritizes the integration of diverse perspectives and expertise. One of our focus group participants, James Hamilton, who's the executive director of the Nuclear Decommissioning Collaborative, said this in our meeting: process matters, dialogue matters, relationships matter. We're not in a situation where we need a technological solution. We're in a situation where we need political will and partnership building and collaboration and dialogue and courage. Example recommendation would be to designate an institutional home to support ongoing initiatives, investigations, address research gaps, steward, gather, and make data publicly accessible, and also engage governments, tribal governments, and sovereigns, as well as private, regional, and public interest partnerships that can support further public outreach, education, and informed decision-making. So this group is not yet designated. It could be the PG&E's Community Advisory Board that's already formed, but wondering what its focus might be going forward, given that the plant was decommissioned in 2021. There's also other potential foci in the community, that the Harbor District, the Humboldt County adaptation planning efforts, even Cal Poly Humboldt's Sea Level Rise Institute could support some of this work. The second recommendation is to fund joint fact-finding, and this idea is to advance systemic scientific understanding of multiple failures, potentially exacerbated by climate and coastal hazard vulnerabilities that impact on-site protection, access, waste retrieval, and waste transport. During one of our focus group sessions, Kate Huckelbridge, the Federal Consistency Director at the Coastal Commission, had said this: in order to design a project to protect the hill, Boone Point, you have to figure out what you're protecting from and how much. Well, how much is justified, and what is the range of solutions to protect for whatever time frame is needed. I think some of the risk-based studies would be really helpful to clarify what the risks are from sea level rise, tsunami, a stacked event with an earthquake, etc. So from our focus group workshops, example recommendations emerged to generate updated studies and analyses of Humboldt Bay conditions and biophysical factors that account for climatic change. These include, maybe as a priority, storm wave modeling to understand erosion of the riprap wall and the hydrodynamics, the changing hydrodynamics of Humboldt Bay in light of sea level rise change, and how sediment transport might change with these changing hydrodynamics. tsunami modeling that might factor in sea level rise projections, and soil liquefaction and soil interaction with the concrete vault, should there be inflow or outflow waves that have the potential to scour Boone Point. The third recommendation is to review the existing management, monitoring, and mitigation strategies that are already identified by PG&E and in collaboration or in coordination with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So this would require examining existing transportation plans, emergency plans, contingency planning, and drills, and risk mitigation plans for the ways in which they do or do not accommodate for changing climate risk and coastal hazards. If anyone heard Lori Dengler's talk on the history of this site, we know that there's paleoseismic studies weren't available during the time that the site was constructed and built. And at the same time, we've understood now sea level rise to be a much more important factor impacting the integrity of this site going into the future. We understand that now more than we did in the early 2000s when the ISFC was licensed. And so in light of these knowns, it's important to recognize the status quo. In light of those changes, as Jenna Gagnon, the Sustainability and Government Affairs Director at Blue Lake Rancheria, said during our workshop, what we know now is the waste is going to be there forever. That's the paradigm we should plan for. It's certainly the paradigm that the tribe is planning for. We're not planning for it to be moved. This is also not something that we can leave to a natural retreat or living shoreline. So the recommendation is to investigate mitigation strategies and their alternatives to protect the site from sea level rise risk and other coastal geological hazards. And this might require the development of a plan for armoring Boone Point, which would require short-term bolstering or analyses into costs and benefits of long-term engineering solutions, inquiries into coastal commission permitting, material amendments, cost analyses, and responsible parties, which integrate, of course, the U.S. Army Corps, the Harbor District tribes, and a wide variety of affected stakeholders. These are long-term, complex projects that need to begin soon if they're going to protect the site by 2065. Recommendation 4 is to update PG&E and NRC standards. The objective here is to provide our recommendations to PG&E and the nuclear industry with collaboration, transparency, public safety, and mutual beneficial relationships in mind. Mike Wilson from our Humboldt County District Supervisor and the California Coastal Commission North Coast District Commissioner had said to us during the focus group that from my perspective, the whole site could use an analysis for potential redesign, assuming you can't relocate the waste in the short term. The assumption that it isn't the best design or location based on new information related to sea level rise warrants reevaluation and potential redesign or reconfiguration. I think advocating for that is a reasonable perspective. So an example recommendation would be to first request that the final safety analysis reporting that PG&E submits to the NRC annually be updated with Patton et al., an article in press, as the best available science on sea level rise projections for Humboldt Bay, rather than using NOAA data that's outdated. And to also potentially price out the cost of and the logistics of PG&E obtaining a cask transporter, which would be a device for removing the casks in the event of a need for repair or in an event of the need to do additional monitoring or evaluation of their integrity. Currently, this cask transporter is stationed at Diablo Canyon, 9 or 10 hour drive away from our community. There could be potential benefit to our own ISFC having its own device so that it can retrieve waste and maintain it, repair it with due diligence in a reasonable amount of time. should access be inundated or there be a need. Recommendation 5 is to explore beyond design basis accident scenarios. This is really responding to many of our participants' question about, hey, what's the plan if we have a major event? I don't know if anyone's really thought about the planning around these contingencies, and it may be because the position of PG&E in the industry is that these are no risk, these hypotheticals, there's no risk of them coming into being. Despite that being their position, I think our focus group participants were willing to go to this place of exploring beyond design basis accidents or accidents that aren't factored into the current design parameters of this ISFC. So exploring these scenarios and evaluating or assessing the consequences of worst case ISFC accidents is the recommendation. And in talking with Adam Cantor, the Natural Resources Director of the Wiyot Tribe, this recommendation came out of some of the conversations that he began in saying, hey, I guess I am just concerned over all life and future life. Should something go wrong with the storage facility, I think it would be catastrophic and take generations to recover. And so we did take the time to carefully think through potential scenarios where the welds on the bolts of the canisters are cracking, where there's a potential for radioactive shielding to be lost, heat transfer functions to be disabled by events that are caused by tsunamis, earthquakes, or a combination of multiple failures. This exercise really questions whether the margin of safety that is prescribed by the current design basis assumptions are sufficiently adequate to protect public health and safety. The sixth and last recommendation is to enhance public engagement. The idea here is to inform and not alarm. And the objectives are to increase the public's understanding of the current and future risks facing the ISFC without igniting unsubstantiated fears. Create avenues for sustained engagement, information sharing, and trust building, and lifting up and listening to the voices of the tribes in our region and our community members. Amanda Admire, a lecturer in physics and geological oceanography here at Cal Poly Humboldt and a Redwood Coast Tsunami Work Group collaborator in our workshops, said, how do we build resilience in a community? How do we introduce them to the hazards that are there without completely terrifying a community, but them showing them the steps that they can take to be safe in those situations? So example recommendations may be making real-time updates regarding nuclear waste policy developments more accessible, making site inspection reports more accessible, bluff erosion monitoring reports more accessible so that the public understands what the potential risks are and what the accountability to staying vigilant to those risks looks like and who's doing that work and how thorough they're doing that work, and make that more transparent. Second, improve science communication in the community through arts, community festivals, and talkback events. Alec and I participated in a theater talkback event, and also the Which Way the Wind Festival panel, looking at climate change and nuclear energy. So these conversations, I think, were helpful in helping us face the public in a manner that promoted more intersections across the space of nuclear expert and community member with legitimate questions. A couple more slides just to show you how we think moving forward could be supported by some adaptation pathways planning frameworks. These frameworks are developed around certain thresholds or tipping points. So if you look at the figure on the left, you see a blue line in the middle there, a blue straight horizontal line. Flood risk is managed so that it does not exceed this level, which is set by some policy. In our community or in our particular context, we could come up with, a way of managing risk that identifies a threshold, such as the necessary height of the seawall that is needed to stave off the rising seas, for example. And this kind of approach can be helpful because it identifies when a particular set of actions must be replaced or supplemented by additional actions, or when a change in pathways for a community to remain resilient is important. See the metro figure on the right, which is showing when certain actions open up or suspend future pathways. When there's interacting decisions that foreclose opportunities, it's important to understand in advance where your decision making is leading you, and to be aware of all the potential consequences of future decisions based on current decision making. We made our own metro map as a starting place, which you can find in our own focus group report if you're interested. We also, based on our interviews and our focus group meetings, we developed a few socially relevant triggers, which is an approach to real-time monitoring that can indicate when a system is approaching its threshold of vulnerability and therefore needs adjustment. So in this diagram, each step represents an expression of a collective tolerable level of risk. For example, participants could define these levels, populating a trigger map with quantifiable changes like the number of the days of flooding of King Salmon Avenue. Once that level of that metric is exceeded, then we move into a policy choice that is to raise the elevation of that road, or the number of the days the riprap wall is overtopped per year, or the number of annual emergency repairs. Once those quantified triggers are exceeded, then a policy decision could be made to look into mitigation strategies or implement a mitigation strategy that is more protective of that dynamic erosive section of the South Humboldt Bay. So once these kinds of risks are exceeded, it triggers a stepwise policy and planning approach that advances decision-making incrementally despite ongoing uncertainty. And this is something I think we're going to be needing to do so that we're not suspended with paralysis. A threshold decision, as we began our focus, our focal question, should the waste stay or go? Not that we have any real authoritative determination with respect to that ultimate decision, but I think our research aims to inform a policy agenda that engages tribes and community members in informing this threshold question. Obviously, much more information could be useful, but we certainly caution against excessively studying this topic out of fear that indecision is worse than making decisions and adapting them as new insights emerge using adaptive policy planning pathways or dynamic adaptation policy planning pathways approaches. Nevertheless, we know technical backstopping as a viable entry point around which we can position our voice and advocacy. So learning about what these triggers and thresholds are, informing those with best available science, and using those to inform community dialogue in light of ultimate interest in informing a policy agenda that is more amenable to local input and engagement. This is the last slide of the second section, which is just to show that we've been working on this project for about 1.5 years, and the funding has come to an end, but we've produced some products that we think are useful in supporting a platform for continuation of this conversation. We have 2 public-facing websites, the first detailing the history and the regulatory background of Humboldt Bay Spent Nuclear Fuel Site, and the second website, which is depicted here at 44feetproject.com, is a repository for relevant documents, research developments, updates, research products like our focus group report, which you can read if you're interested, a comment we just submitted to the California Public Utility Commission in support of PG&E settlement proposal to do an updated tsunami and sea level rise assessment of the Humboldt Bay Isthmus, but with some conditions, some of which I've alluded to in this presentation. A calendar where you can learn about events that will engage the community further. There's also a link to stay involved through an email. You can enter your email on the website and keep in touch through that channel as well. So here's our last and short section of our presentation. So Alec is going to lead off this final section.
Thank you, Jen. So I guess the idea here is that as we start to get a pulse on the Humboldt Bay community, maybe we should look to the larger national or international community to share our interests, share our findings, but also to take a note from these books or learn some lessons that are happening around the world, because coastal nuclear power plants are doing different things. This interactive map from the Carbon Brief shows the location of nuclear power plants around the world. According to the World Association of Nuclear Operators, around 1 in 4 of the world's 460 commercial nuclear reactors are situated on coastlines. And that makes sense because you need water to cool reactors. And this is just how things are done with this technology. But many were built only 30 to 70 feet, about 10 to 20 meters above sea level, at a time when climate change was hardly considered a threat. And so as we start to look at, the various nuclear reactors being constructed in the South China Sea, for example, and in megaquake potential areas, let alone, Fukushima changes to the NRC regulations and updated safety protocols. Can we review these? Can we share our insights? Can we learn from other communities? There are international organizations and coalitions that are dealing with this perhaps differently. And, maybe we're a small and somewhat politically inert community, but that's not to say that we don't have influence and we can't learn and share from our experiences. And so Jen will get this one.
Thanks, Alec. And I think maybe by politically inert, you maybe meant like politically remote. I think this community is really powerful politically in a lot of ways. And we're really carrying the torch from many engaged members of our community who were involved in the decommissioning process, and which really did have a very strong impact on the way that the Humboldt Bay former nuclear power plant was decommissioned. But I think what we've heard in our conversations is that, there's not as many people living in the Humboldt region as there are maybe in near the Diablo Canyon site. There's not as much media and political power and engine driving the policy agenda in Humboldt as there may be in other parts of, say, California. And so I think building coalition is going to be really important for us here in Humboldt. But I think to go back to our beginning slides and to loop back to a closure here, Alec mentioned the new construction of power plants. Approximately 60 new power plants are under construction. Most of them, as Alec mentioned, in China, Russia, and India. In China, there are 4 nuclear reactors in Sanmen County, a coastal county subject to risk of megathrust earthquakes, Richter magnitude 9, with 20-meter waves projected to originate from a ridge in the eastern China Sea. The elevation of that plant is 8 meters above sea level, maybe 27 feet, approximately above sea level. You can see there's some similarities here. There's some breakwaters, but it's unclear whether there's a site-specific tsunami analysis done for that facility. And so I think what our research is really advocating, not only for Humboldt Bay ISPC, but for ISPCs and coastal climate risk locations, is that there is incredible importance of site-specific risk analysis, not only to, again, operating nuclear plants, but to ISPCs as well, like ours, that are subject to these hazards. After Fukushima, the NRC issued guidance to U.S. facilities for avoiding under-predicting events and underestimating tsunami and other risks. But NRC regulations only require floods to be evaluated for ISPCs, and not tsunamis, not sea level rise, not erosion. So again, the site-specific analysis is really important. Additionally, post-Fukushima regulations of the NRC require mitigation of beyond design basis events. In some of those instances, those are all applicable to operating facilities, but there is no regulation requiring mitigation of beyond design basis events for ISFACs. So if anything, we want to direct a policy agenda that says that these requirements for tsunami and accident analyses apply to ISFACs, or should apply to ISFACs that are subject to coastal hazard and climate risk. Finally, our approach is one that aims for zero risk tolerance. Based on what Adam Cantor said at the Wiyot tribe and other members of our focus group, this is incredibly important to them. Not about alleviating damage from potential accidents. And so I think we are looking at, how can we be prudent? How can we be stewards of this potential risk? And looking at even California's prudent manager standard, which dictates, like NEPA does as well in the environmental law landscape, that the greater the risk and uncertainty involved in a decision, the greater the care the utility must take in reaching that decision. The larger the scale of risk, the larger and more commensurate needs to be the scale of the analysis to make sure that there's zero risk. And so I think, and our research is really aiming in that direction. And I think that is because of our community's love for and attachment to the health and resilience of our bay and our community and our tribes in our region.
Okay, so amidst all of the political barriers and the complex science and climate change flanking us and set to, manifest on the landscape, we have to start thinking about these new futures. And we understand that policy resilience doesn't emerge from accidents alone. It emerges from conscientiousness and civically engaged planning and institutions and ideologies and ideas. And I think something that Jen said to me earlier was that, imagination itself is a form of action if we look at it that way. And that's exactly what we did with this project. We put imagination to work and developed the scenario planning, met these heuristics, these tools that can help us remove ourselves from this state of paralysis to a state of action and moving forward. And so we aim to cultivate these characteristics and leverage them for policy influence and to understand that how our influence in this region, and it prides itself on being a resilient one. Sea level rise simply wasn't considered when the site was constructed. And so that was our framework. We said, let's engage participants around that in this well-established scenario planning method to facilitate this information exchange. What are the risks? Not only in reality, the material risks, but what do you think the risks are? Because those mean something as well. If we're going to move together as a coalition, as a strong community, we have to be understanding of everybody's understanding. So scenario planning, once again, weaves together this science and this imagination, and it tells these really important stories to communicate meaning, and it creates these tangible futures that we actually created together with our participants. These outcomes have informed community engaged recommendations, as you saw earlier, and we hope that to carry them on further in a way that maybe can get us out from this deep sleep and into a future of empowered safety, because that's so important for this community and the resilience and the health and the vitality of Humboldt Bay. And I'll just leave everybody with this quote by Marcus Cicero. More is lost by indecision than wrong decision. Indecision is the thief of opportunity. It will steal you blind. And I think that's just so true, especially in this context and uncertainty and complexity. Let's make some decisions. If we get it wrong, we can come back and revisit it. And that's exactly what our framework and scenario planning helped us do. So I'll end it there, and I hope that we can engage in a really nice conversation. Please, we welcome your questions. Feel free to contact myself or Jen. Visit our website, 44feetproject.com. And thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jen and Alec. That was wonderful. So we have a little over 20 minutes for talking, answering some questions. I'm going to start with a short one that's talking a little bit about your scenario worlds. It's a question from me and a question from Jeff Block, and I'm going to put them together and allow you to answer as you choose. And then we'll get into a little bit more of the technical information. I just thought it was really powerful, your description of using scenario worlds as a tool. And for me, it was evoking that creative effort that's associated with writing, reading, and analyzing science fiction. And so I was wondering if you could reflect on this disciplinary overlap a little bit. And on a related note, I'll share what Jeff had to say, which was that the scenario planning workshop approach reminded him of A Message from the Future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and A Message from the Future 2, The Years of Repair by Naomi Klein. And he was wondering if you were aware of those initiatives and wanted to speak to them at all. So. And you're muted.
Yeah, we were trying to, we're all over the place.
Too much at once, huh?
No, I'm not aware of those initiatives by AOC, but they sound really interesting. And I would like if we could share those with us. I don't know if they're in the chat already, but that's definitely something I'd like to follow up on.
I think what's common in those examples is the question that I think I heard Ezra Klein pose to Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote The Ministry for the Future, which is another example in that same genre, which is, who is going to do the collective imagining of our future? And in a way, it was in this context of Kim Stanley Robinson talking about blimp travel and this way of like sustaining this slow pace of COVID traveling over the earth in a way that was deliberate and slow and, using future innovation, but in a way that moved us closer to some sort of past. And so I think there's an intersection of timelines that goes back and forth and it doesn't necessarily attach itself to a particular time and space. And I think spent nuclear fuel has exactly the same attributes. It's like the object is from the past, it's in the present, and it's in the future all at the same time. And how do we slowly travel over the expansive distance of that huge space and do it in such a way that's deliberate and intentional, where we're not popping the balloon? We need to stay sustained over that space. And I think the work of science fiction and those artists is really helpful. It's wild to me that some of the best climate change work is coming in the form of science fiction, because I think our political systems are broken, our legal systems are blinded to the societal challenges that are, quote, political questions that I believe is a punt to to Congress and other branches of government. I do think courts have a role to play in these spaces, but everyone looks the other way. And so we look to our science fiction writers to direct us to keep attached, I think, to the values that we think are most important, so that they don't feel so distant, and keeping everything close by. And I think what's so interesting, and I'll stop, is after these casks are underground and out of sight, out of mind. And there's this question about, how do we leave the waste for future generations? If we bury waste in a repository, there's lots of articles and studies about, how would we symbolize that there's a repository of very, radioactive waste for those in the future that inherit the earth, that have no connection to our decision making now. And, would you put a skull and crossbones on it, or would you put, I think the consensus was you would not put any symbols on it at all, so as not to mislead or encourage, exhuming that waste. And so I think it's an interesting question, is like, we're looking for the language and the symbology around how do we tell our future generations what we chose and why we chose what we chose, and we don't have the words for it.
Yeah, it's an incredible cognitive and linguistic exercise, and it's too often just talked about as technology.
Definitely.
Well, I'm going to move forward actually then to a question from Jen Kalt that I think reflects this sort of the changing of time within the Humboldt Bay space. So she says that PG&E's assessment of risk assumes a static physical environment, but we know the bay is changing and not always in ways we understand. For example, adding riprap in one location can cause erosion in another part of the shoreline. Changes in the tidal prism can cause increases in erosion or deposition. Funding to better understand these mechanisms is critical, but also how do we increase the transparency and communication between PG&E and scientists and community members?
Well, I think that's an important question because it really harkens to the need for collaboration across the Bay. And what do we do when we have disparate community members and entities and tribal governments and industries who all have different prerogatives, different funding streams? How do we get them to work together so that we're not, creating more problems where we're trying to create solutions? And I think talking, the idea here is we are questioning the assumptions of PG&E. I mean, I think that goes without saying. We're not trying to demonize them or make them an enemy. In fact, I think what's important here is that we start to speak their language a bit. And their assumption is that it's going to be gone before any of these worst impacts really manifest. And so with that in mind, how do we bring it to the fact that there's a lot at stake for whatever it may be? What are they interested in? Likely, financial incentives, public image, things like that. And how do we bring them about and bring them into this conversation so that there are mutually beneficial outcomes? I think that's going to be huge. I haven't really discovered a way yet. We think about it all the time, but they're sort of insular. They've tried to be receptive to our work, and they've engaged. I think at a minimum they've engaged, but it's like the next step. It's hard to really pin that down at this point. I think we're trying to understand their language from the point of view of what are their interests, but also we have to speak their language in terms of the science and the probabilities. They're speaking in this way that I think scenario planning goes completely against. I mean, it includes those probabilities and includes these projections, but it's saying there's a different way to look at this. So how do we reconcile those two languages, I guess, is the hard part. And I don't know how to do that yet. I wish I did.
I think there's two things, and it's an interesting thing, Alec, you mentioned reconciling the two languages, because there are, as I mentioned, there are NRC requirements for mitigation of beyond design basis events. They just don't apply to ISPC. So PG&E already has, and NRC already has these tools. It's just maybe directing the consideration of applying them to these site-specific analyses when prudent. And so there is, I think, potential for that if that was in their interest, which it does appear to be, given the likelihood that this waste is going to be there beyond 2032. But the other thing I think is that we did support PG&E's proposal to do hazard risk assessment, tsunami and sea level rise assessment in a comment to the California Public Utility Commission, which is a publicly available comment on you can go and see it off the CPUC website, or there's a link to it on our website. But really what we wanted to support, Jen, was not just a money for PG&E to do the assessment, but to form an independent science and technical advisory group. So it would be a joint fact-finding approach to the science and the work conducted, versus us just supporting PG&E's own scientists to do the work internally, to externally mobilize this resource so that it's informed by our best available science, as well as an ethics committee or a participation by community and tribal members, so that that science is being applied in ways that make sense to those other interests as well. So that might be one way. I don't know how receptive PG&E will be to that comment, but I think there are open comments, and if anyone wants to submit additional comments to PG&E's proposal, you can do that on the CPUC website.
So here's a question related to transparency, but not necessarily from PG&E here. So this is from James Graham, and he says, the information I have from the state of Nevada and scientists that were involved in the Yucca Mountain site was that the site was too porous and radioactive material could escape into the water table. So it appears that this is not just a political issue, and the federal government may not be communicating the entire picture. There are also instances of incorrect information being distributed by private companies and the federal government. So he asks, how about including uncertainty estimates for sources of information based on past performance?
Yeah, that's a really interesting proposal. I think the question would be what the methodology of a study like that would be to determine like who decides the ranking of what information is uncertain, and how do you understand truth in reporting and the reporter's newspaper and or the federal agency's affiliation with a particular administration, and how all that context influences the public media that is produced or shared. So I think it would be a really interesting question to figure out, like, how would you do that study rigorously and robustly, just because there's such a potential for bias in determining like whether information is actually uncertain. But maybe there's more quantifiable metrics for determining uncertainty that could be used as opposed to subjective analyses. But I do think you'd have to look at like the wider context of how the information was produced and what time and what political era and all those things.
I would just say, I think once again, the value of our research comes from the idea that we're trying to understand our local community better and understand the local phenomenon, the social and political barriers, but also opportunities to this. So yes, uncertainty is a major factor in this, but if we can pinpoint what the issues are, at least for our local community, and if other communities are doing this, perhaps there's a workaround, and I don't know exactly how this would work, but if we're not relying on one central government mouthpiece saying all of these things, and this is on record, this is how they do it, and this is the directive, and that's that, we can have communities sort of on the peripheral in a way, and that could potentially increase that transparency, increase an understanding of the risks across the board. But I still think, yes, the uncertainty is something we need to address in that, and hopefully that comes about by doing this work. And if this work is done the same way or similarly in other communities, maybe we can figure that out.
Okay, so I'm going to pivot to a very different kind of question. This is from Roseanne Retkiewicz. Is the spent fuel stored in the Humboldt area eligible for providing supply for the high assay, low enrichment uranium, HALEU, fuel manufacturing used in newly developed ASMRs? She notes that some recent publications indicate that spent fuel retains 90% of its fuel, providing energy, and could be used by some of these. And she recommends that we look at Oklo's recent press release. Is that anything that you're positioned to comment on?
Not likely. I mean, I've done my own sort of research on the side, and I know that these small modular reactors are sort of touted as being able to decrease the waste produced from generation. I've actually come across a Stanford article that actually said the opposite of that, and it said that these SMRs will actually create more. So once again, we kind of go back to the previous question: is what science is correct? Who do we know what to trust? But as far as I understand, the United States has a non-proliferation agreement such that we don't reuse, recycle, reprocess our waste. Once it's gone through the cycle, it needs to be cooled and disposed of either temporarily or in a DGR once that becomes available. Whether that policy change is in the near future with the production of these SMRs, I don't know. It's something to look out for. but I'd say it's likely not going to happen unless a major policy change precedes it. I wish I knew more.
Okay, a couple specific questions about this. Well, one about the site. What, if anything, is allowed on the decommissioned site neighboring the spent fuel storage? So what's actually happening there at the location now?
So it's still owned and operated by Pacific Gas and Electric. And it is their site to generate electricity. They use fossil fuels, natural gas now. So that's the generating station that's, I think, 3 feet above sea level at the northwest corner, I believe, or northeast corner. I was going to go back in the slides, but it's still PG&E, and as long as they have that generating station there that uses fossil fuels, it will remain in PG&E hands. It's not open to the public. They do allow walk-arounds, and they do tours if you ask. And you can see it, but as far as retrofitting or renovating it to become something different, it's not in that stage yet.
One of the important legacies of the Community Advisory Board that PG&E organized to support partnership with community in the decommissioning process was that, and many of you may be here with us in this webinar and could speak to this much more specifically and accurately than I can, but the requirement of our own Community Advisory Board was that the site be restored to sustainable agriculture standards. And so the restoration work that was done as part of the decommissioning project was driven by the community's agenda, given its proximity to the bay. And our Craig Benson, who we worked with to facilitate our focus group work, was part of some of that restoration work. And I think there's a really high standard that was supported through the advocacy of our community for the restoration of the site.
Okay, just a few more questions, and then I know we're hitting time. Jenna Bader wants to know, is there any organization that checks the safety of nuclear reactors globally? And notes that it's terrifying thinking of how many are out there and how vulnerable we are. So I think you made some references to that in your presentation. I didn't know if you want to drop a link in the chat for more information, or.
I believe it's the International Atomic Energy Association or Administration. I'd have to look that up real quick though. But I believe there are international agreements. So that's one of the reasons that deep sea burial was taken off of the table. International agreements would not allow, they prohibited us from burying, any nation from burying it in deep sea beds or, delivering the waste to the ocean. Let me just look that up real quick. Maybe you can come back and if I find it, I'll put it in the chat, whether it's the International Atomic Energy Agency. Thank you.
James Graham sent it to us, so it's in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, so we have a lot of interested and active people, and I know a lot of the longtime locals in the area, have been engaged in the decommissioning effort and protection effort for a long time. So one of the attendees asked, if the funding for this project has run out, is there a leadership board that concerned stakeholders can join?
Just with discreetly organized around this particular project at the moment, no. I think one of the questions emerging from our research was, what institution is best positioned to do the work? And it sounds like there's no consensus on a definitive organization, and given the cross-intersectional issues engaged, it may be best served by a coalition of different organizations doing different parts or building different agendas. The Sea Level Rise Institute at Cal Poly Humboldt is an organization that is co-led by faculty in our department at the Environmental Science and Management School at Humboldt, along with the Wiyot tribe. It's co-chaired, and members of the community are invited to join the Sea Level Rise Institute. We also have members of the Coastal Commission, other tribal nation and rancheria members, other scientists, residents that join these monthly meetings. So if you're interested, I think the best place, although it's not discreetly focused on this issue, to turn to might be the Sea Level Rise Institute, which is HSLRI, I think. Dot, I don't know if it's com or edu. I think there's emerging conversations about where this work can be housed, but I think that our recommendation that it be integrated into sea level rise adaptation planning in our region more broadly can be a way to sort of distribute the work and the leadership across our community, which may be the interim solution until there's a more formal institution that might carry this work forward.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to drop the link for the Sea Level Rise Institute.
Oh, you got it. Better than mine. Thanks.
Okay. So Joe McManus wanted to know whether there's an NRC requirement for an IFC licensee to conduct a sea level rise analysis upon the facility. And he said, it seems like there isn't, as my understanding is that NEPA would require the federal agency here, NRC, to examine the impacts of the proposed action upon the environment and not vice versa. So given that, should there be an effort for proposed rulemaking to the NRC to require if it's really hard to say ISFCs. Writing it is easier than saying it. ISFCs to conduct sea level analyses, and if so, what statutory authority could the NRC use to require the analysis? I know that's a big question.
I think I have to do some research on that. I don't know off the top of my head. NEPA would have to be triggered by major federal agency action, so that would have to be some kind of license renewal. So when the spent fuel casks are needing to be renewed, or the site license needs to be renewed, or something like that, that might trigger NEPA. But there must be. I mean, there's the prudent manager standard in California that applies to PG&E that could be applicable. That's not a rulemaking. So I'd have to think about, what particular regulations under the NRC, but I believe they're accident scenario regulations and that guide instances where NRC can require beyond mitigation accident and consequence analyses. And so maybe it would be looking closer into those areas of the NRC regulations. Those are post Fukushima regulations. And there's some specific named regulations in our focus group report, I believe, that make this suggestion, and the recommendations to PG&E in the industry section. I think it's recommendation 4. There's some specific regs cited in that document you could look at, and I don't know off the top of my head the numbers, but I think that would be where I would start. Yeah. But it's a good question, and I think it deserves some careful legal attention or policy analysis. But off the top of my head, that would be the best answer I have for the moment.
I think that's a great start. So the last question is actually going to be from me. So you both articulated some community next steps, a bunch of community next steps during the presentation. And I know that funding is often an obstacle to getting efforts off the ground. So if I were a foundation looking to protect the Humboldt Bay community from hazards related to the decommissioned nuclear plant, pick a spot. Where would you suggest that I begin?
What a tough question, because you're talking specifically to direct funding, right? Mm-hmm.
I mean, my quick and easy answer, I think, might be to fund, again, an independent science technical advisory group that would advise PG&E and work with PG&E to come up with more up-to-date risk assessments of coastal hazards and climate risk to the ISFC. And also maybe that body could be state, oriented more externally toward the state of California. So it could be a technical and scientific advisory body that would examine risks and or opportunities for managing risks to Humboldt Bay, ISFC, Diablo Canyon, and Songs as a California state initiative. I do think Humboldt would be best served if our interests were emerging as part of a coalition that had more potential to influence the state's political agenda. And I do think an ethics committee like Germany has, comprised of community members, potentially impacted residents, or those that have interest in these conversations to guide the application of the science. So I would fund like a clearinghouse where those independent advisory bodies could inform how the industries operate in our state and have directive from the governor's office to do that and potentially influence state regulation. Although again, we come up against the preemption question again with NRC, so there would have to be some blessing by the chairperson of the NRC to take these recommendations into consideration.
And I'll just say, not to toot our own horn, but I think the tremendous amount of work we've done in a year and a half on this, just to get this off the ground, I think this research agenda could continue on. So if you were to fund a few graduate students or something in the future, that would be cool. And I'm not just being coy, I'm serious. Like it's an amazing opportunity. I think we've engaged this community in ways that, grad students and grad advisors and the community at Humboldt State or Cal Poly Humboldt really do an amazing job with. So that could be another revenue stream, perhaps. But good question.
I think those are great answers. And as we wrap, I just want to thank you both. I think this is sometimes emotionally heavy, intellectually heavy, responsibility laden work. And I'm just so grateful that you're both doing it and that you're helping the community, move forward with this conversation. So thank you. And thank you for everyone who came tonight.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I just want to say to all of our attendees, we hope you'll join us again for 2 webinars this April. On April 6th, guest speaker Jola Ajibade will explore the justice conundrum in coastal adaptation. Should we retreat or invest in floating climatopias? And then on April 27th, our offshore wind research team will share our latest findings on the vulnerability of seabirds to floating wind generation off the California coast. So we hope you'll join us for these events. And for more information, please visit shotcenter.org. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again to Jen and Alec.
Thank you.
Good night.